Hello again, friends. Welcome back to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. And we're working together through the entire Bible, chapter by chapter, verse by verse. And today we've reached Numbers chapter 20. And we're going to try and do the whole chapter today, all 29 verses. I think one of the most important, yet most often forgotten spiritual lessons in the Bible is this. Let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. I'm quoting here from Paul's first letter to Corinthians, chapter 10, verse 12. This statement appears in that passage, but it's a passage in which Paul is giving an illustration for us, and the illustration he wants to give, Paul actually quotes this story that we're going to look at today in Numbers chapter 20 to make his point. So this tells me that the lesson we're meant to learn today is an important one because it applied in both these ancient times, the New Testament times, and I would say it still applies to our lives today. You see, some people fall into the trap of thinking, I've been through all of this before. I've experienced failure before. I've been through trials before. I've learned my lesson. And all of that may be true, but it can lead some people to believe that they won't make the same mistakes again when confronted with a similar situation. Others may think, you know what, I used to do that when I was a young Christian. I'd never fall into that sort of trap or behavior again. Almost thinking because that you've been a believer for many years, it makes you immune to the struggles and the temptations that you face. However, Scripture warns us that we are capable of stumbling at any time. So when you feel confident in your faith, be warned. The moment you start to think you stand securely, you're most in danger of falling. What's the expression? Pride comes before the fall. So in today's episode, it's a sobering reminder that our strength in all of this, in all of these battles, comes from God Himself, not our own abilities. So welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Today we're going to explore the whole Numbers chapter 20 because this passage provides an outstanding lesson on the topic, sometimes paraphrased from Proverbs 16:18 as pride comes before a fall. Now, rather than reading the entire chapter in one go, it's a very lengthy chapter again, we'll explore it piece by piece. The initial part of the passage discusses an unexpected rebellion, a surprising twist again. So let me begin by just reading the first verse for you, which says, Then the children of Israel, the whole congregation, came into the wilderness of Zin in the first month, and the people stayed in Kadesh, and Miriam died there and was buried there. Now we know already from reading through these books together of the Old Testament that after leaving Egypt, the people arrived at Kadesh Barnea, and the Lord declared at that point, because of their reticence, they would not enter the promised land, leading to, 38 years of them wandering in the wilderness. Although it's commonly referred to as 40 years, technically I think it was 38 years due to the 2 years of stuff and the stuff happening in Sinai that we've had described for us. Anyway, after leaving Egypt, they journeyed first to Sinai, where they received the law in the book of Exodus. We saw that outlined for us. Leviticus was then set during their time at Sinai, and then right up to now, this point in Numbers chapters 11 and 12, we finally saw them depart Sinai and travel to Kadesh Barnea. Now, another significant detail in verse 1 is that it mentions Miriam's death and the fact that she's buried at Kadesh. Now, it's worth noting that over 600,000 people will die, at least 600,000 during this 38-year period. But this point and Miriam dying marks the end of this chapter of their journey. So now we'll begin in verse 2 as a new phase unfolds for us. And it says, Now there was no water for the congregation, so they gathered together against Moses and Aaron. And the people contended with Moses and spoke, saying, If only we had died when our brethren died before the Lord. Why have you brought up the assembly of the Lord into this wilderness, that we and our animals should die here? And why have you made us come out of Egypt to bring us to this evil place? It's not a place of grain or figs or vines or pomegranates, nor is there even any water to drink. So here we go. Upon arriving at Kadesh, the children of Israel, they find there's no water there, and once again, what do? They turn against Moses and Aaron, again blaming them for their current predicament. This is a familiar scene, isn't it? We've been through this before. They've done this before. Now, Kadesh, although situated in the desert, was actually an oasis, a place with supposed plentiful water supply, making the absence of water here, the children of Israel, rather confusing and hard to interpret what was going on. But the people, instead of turning to the Lord in their frustration, began to lament and moan again. If only we'd died with our brothers died before the Lord. Their contention again is with Moses and Aaron, and it's more than mere disagreement. It's conflict, and it's leading to a potential dispute. They accuse Moses of leading them into the wilderness simply to die, questioning why they even left Egypt to end up in such a desolate place. None of the home comforts they'd enjoyed back in Egypt, they said. It's a rather rosy interpretation of their experience back in Egypt, but it's a familiar story, isn't it? It's a familiar moan, isn't it? They highlight the lack of water. They say it's essential for their survival. They need it, of course, to feed their livestock. But note that this complaint exactly echoes the grievances we've seen before of their forefathers. This is all revealing a concerning pattern of behavior that is being repeated across the generations. Now, Moses himself, he's familiar with this sort of thing. He's heard these complaints before, and he responds in this way. Verse 6 to 11. So Moses and Aaron went from the presence of the assembly to the door of the tabernacle of meeting, and they fell on their faces, and the glory of the Lord appeared to them. Then the Lord spoke to Moses, saying, Take the rod, you and your brother Aaron, gather the congregation together. Speak to the rock before them, before their eyes, and it will yield water. Thus you shall bring water for them out of the rock, and give drink to the congregation and their animals. So Moses took the rod from the Lord, as he commanded him, and Moses and Aaron gathered the assembly together before the rock. And then he said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water out of a rock for you? Then Moses lifted his hand and struck the rock twice with the rod, and water came out abundantly, and the congregation and their animals drink. Now hold on here. There's something going on here. Now, this is not the first time we've seen something like this happen. When Moses was challenged before, he went and said to the Lord, Lord, this is a problem. Let's make it your problem, not mine. What do I do? And the Lord appears and again says, well, this time he says, take the rod, and you and your brother Aaron are to gather the community together and speak to them in front of the rock. Speak to everyone, and they will see miraculously that the rock will bring forth water. Then they can bring the water so that the whole nation can not only have a drink themselves, but they can water their animals. Now, this is one of those places where it's a good place to make a mark in your Bible. Sometimes it's important to underline things, and this is one of them, because this is a point that is often missed. In Numbers 20, verse 8, we saw God say to Moses to speak to the rock. Now, either in your Bible or in your mind, please underline that. It's very important. God said, speak to the rock. He said, take the rod and speak to the rock. Don't use the rod in any way. He didn't refer to that. He just said, take it and speak to the rock. So he takes it, but he's to speak to the rock. The rod isn't mentioned to be used in any way. But in verse 9, it says, Moses took the rod from before the Lord as he has commanded him. Okay, so far so good. Let's just take a minute. What does he mean when he says he takes the rod before the Lord? People often think that this is referring to Moses' staff that he carried, like the big walking stick, if you like, to aid his walking. What's going on here is the tabernacle. Remember, that's where we've gone. They've gone to the tabernacle. into the Holy of Holies, and there's a veil there that separates the holy place and the Holy of Holies. And inside the Holy of Holies, beyond the veil, is the ark, and in the ark was the rod. So it is this rod that he takes before the people, just like the Lord told him to do. So good so far. But then verse 10 says, Moses and Aaron gather the assembly of people together before the rock and said to them, Hear now, you rebels, must we bring water out of a rock for you? Look at verse 10 carefully. We are meant to see Moses as irritated here. It's clear. He says, You rebels, he calls them. And then in verse 11 it says, Moses struck the rock twice with his rod, and water came out, and the congregation and their animals drank. Okay, they've got an abundant supply of water. But what did the Lord tell Moses to do? Speak to the rock, he said. What did he actually do? He struck the rock. And not only did he say, look at what the Lord's going to do, he said, must we bring water out of the rock for you? Now, this is a dramatic and important point in the book of Numbers. You may have noticed many times I've pointed out so far as we've been going through this book that it is clear that Moses did exactly what the Lord told him to do, but clearly not on this occasion. I have lost count of the number of times I've repeatedly said that he did exactly what he was told to do, but this time he doesn't do what he's told to do at all. He gets the rod, but he strikes the rock not once, but twice. Now, that's a little confusing. Now, we can understand why people miss this or can be confused by this. They can even sometimes mix it up with a similar thing happened earlier. It happened in the book of Exodus when they left Egypt in chapter 17. They were without water on that occasion and Moses was instructed on that occasion to strike the rock with his staff, and out came water. So in a sense, he's done, almost the exact same thing before, only the Lord this time told him to speak to the rock, not to strike it. So apparently what we're meant to see here is that Moses, his patience has been exhausted with the people. He calls them rebels, and with a fit of pique, he strikes the rock twice. And this gets the Lord's attention. Let's see how he responds, verses 12 to 13. Then the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron and says, Because you did not believe me to hallow me in the eyes of the children of Israel, therefore you shall not bring this assembly into the land which you have given them. This was the water of Meribah, because the children of Israel contended with the Lord, and he was hallowed among them. Now, there's a couple of things here we're going to have to stand on at this point. It's clear, I have to say, that Moses has disobeyed the Lord here. That is an accurate description of what's just occurred. The Lord said, speak, but Moses struck. But the text actually says, he did this because you didn't believe me. The point I want to make about this is it's teaching us that we are to trust and obey the Lord. Like the hymn says, trust and obey, because there's no other way. To be happy in Jesus is to trust and obey. Now, I think a lot of preachers and Bible teachers very clearly are wanting people to obey the Lord. So there's a lot of preaching done on obedience. Now, that's not at all a bad thing. The Bible certainly has lots of commands and advice about things that we should be obedient to. But I think there's an issue that underpins obedience. And the real issue is, do you believe and do you trust in the Lord? Because if you do that, then you will naturally obey him. Let's not try and put the cart before the horse, so to speak. Because whether or not you obey God will depend on whether or not you believe in him. It's not just obey, it's about trusting, believing, having faith, and then obeying. And if you don't believe him, then you're not going to trust him and you're not going to obey. So the real issue here and in life is trust and obey, faith and obey. If you have trust, if you have faith, if you do that, then obedience will always naturally follow. So notice he says to Moses, you did not obey me nor hallow me. So what's that about? Well, that's referring to the fact he didn't give the glory to God. In a sense, he took it by referring to himself in the first person along with God as the one who would bring forth this miraculous water. So what he failed to do was obey the Lord. By striking it, he gave the impression that he was involved in the miraculous events that were happening. But truthfully, it couldn't have been done without the Lord allowing it. And on this occasion, it seems the Lord allowed it in grace because of what the people needed, not, in fact, because what Moses has done. So here we have Moses, this faithful servant of God. Moses, the one who has been faithful to the Lord on so many occasions, falls at this late point. As I mentioned a moment ago, he repeatedly has done what the Lord said, but then all of a sudden, like all of people who think they can stand on their own, he falls. Be careful what you think. Again, as Paul said in 1 Corinthians, be careful when you think you stand, lest you fall. So what's going on here? Moses harshly rebukes the people, but he loses his temper and he takes credit for what God is about to do. He's clearly disobeying the God, and in a sense he's not trusting in God's power. He's failing to give God the glory, and as we shall see in a minute, God is going to respond to this situation. So the first 13 verses, we see Moses rebelling against the Lord, disobeying the Lord, and the punishment is, wow, you are not going to go into land. I'm going to take the people in, as I said I was going to do, but you're not going to go with them. This is kind of shocking, isn't it? After all Moses has been through, all of the statements, he just missed this one thing, but it was a big thing, and God says, you're not going to take the people into the land. So the next part of the passage and the journey of the people begins at verse 14. Now Moses sent messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom. Thus says your brother Israel, you know all the hardships that have befallen us, how our fathers went down to Egypt, and we dwelt in Egypt a long time. And the Egyptians afflicted us and our fathers. When we cried out to the Lord, he heard our voice, and sent angels and brought us up out of Egypt. Now here we are in Kadesh, a city on the edge of your border. Please let us pass through your country. We will not pass through your fields or vineyards, nor will we drink water from the wells. We will go along the king's highway, and we will not turn aside to the right or to the left until we have passed through your territory. Okay, at this point in the narrative, remember Moses is still leading people towards the promised land. He's not going to take them in there, we now know, but they're still on their journey, and there's more of this story to come. And the text says that Moses sends messengers from Kadesh to the king of Edom with this message where he's saying, you know about our troubled history. When we cried out to the Lord, God heard our voice and he brought us out of Egypt. But now today we're on the edge of your territory, so please let us pass through. And he promises that they won't drink from the wells, and they'll travel strictly along what's called the King's Highway, and will not veer off that until they've passed right through their territory. So rather than proceeding directly from the north to the south into Canaan, Moses intends to lead the people along this well-trod eastern side of the Dead Sea. This is what was referred to in those days, as we see, as the King's Highway. It was in fact a major trade route that ran through the area, and Moses is simply seeking permission from Edom to use this road. He refers to the Edomites as brothers because, remember, they're descendants of Esau, making them akin, if you like, to the Israelites in a historical and national sense. So they seek to travel along this King's Highway, the normal route, you might say, which stretches from Arabia to Damascus. And Moses assures that the Israelites, when they pass through, will not consume or take any resources from their land or cause any disturbance. They only simply request permission to pass through Edom's land. Well, what about the response? Well, Edom's response is found in verse 18, which, well, that will reveal whether they're going to grant this request or not. Let's see. Then Edom said, you shall not pass through my land, lest I come out against you with a sword. So the children of Israel said to him, "We will go by the highway, and if I or my livestock drink any of your water, then I will pay for it. Let me pass through on foot, nothing more." Then he said, "You shall not pass through." So Edom came out against them with men and with a strong hand. Thus Edom refused to give Israel passage through the territory, so Israel turned away from him. So Edom's response is decidedly unfriendly and antagonistic, isn't it? "Not in your life," he says. "You're not going through my land." It's a very firm reply. Now, it's important to note that the relationship between these two nations, represented by these brothers, was marked by nothing but antagonism, and it still is to this day. In verse 19, we see the Israelites again appeal to Edom, saying, "If we travel, if our livestock drink even a drop of water, we'll pay for it. Please just let us pass through on foot, nothing more." What could be more reasonable, you might say? Well, in verse 20, the king of Edom's response remains resolute. "You shall not pass through." In fact, Edom is then seen to mobilize men and send out a strong force of troops to block Israel's passage. Israel's request was simple: to pass through using the king's highway, as many had done before and since, but Edom was unyielding, deploying an army against Israel to prevent their transit. Okay, where are we? The first part of this chapter illustrates Moses' rebellion against the Lord's command, and the second part details the Israelites' thwarted attempt to travel through Edom via the king's highway. The chapter will conclude with the repercussion of all these events. 22 to the end of the chapter 29. Now the children of Israel, the whole congregation, journeyed from Kadesh and came to Mount Hor. And the Lord spoke to Moses and Aaron in Mount Hor by the border of the land of Edom, saying, "Aaron shall be gathered to his people, for he shall not enter the land which I gave to the children of Israel, because you rebelled against my word at the water of Meribah. Take Aaron and Eleazar his son, and bring them up to Mount Hor, and strip Aaron of his garments, and put them on Eleazar his son. For Aaron shall be gathered to his people, and die there." So Moses did just as the Lord commanded, and went up to Mount Hor in the sight of the whole congregation. Moses then stripped Aaron of his garments and put them on Eleazar his son, and Aaron died there on top of the mountain. Then Moses and Eleazar came down from the mountain. Now when all the congregation saw that Aaron was dead, all the house of Israel mourned Aaron for 30 days. So verse 22 of this closing section begins with the children of Israel, the entire congregation as it's described, departing from Kadesh and arriving at this place called Mount Hor. Now the exact location of Mount Hor is uncertain to this day. It's generally agreed to be near the border of Edom and probably relatively close to Kadesh itself. But this marks a significant detour, a turning around for the Israelites. Now, while the exact identification of where they are is unclear, its likely vicinity is that it lies somewhere between Kadesh and in the opposite direction of what would have been the King's Highway. So this narrative then shifts to Moses and Aaron as they arrive at this place called Mount Hor, where we see the Lord communicate that Aaron also will not enter the promised land due to their disobedience at the waters of Meribah. This is a pivotal moment in the story of the children of Israel and their wandering in the wilderness, and it's revealed here that Aaron's journey will also end before reaching the promised land. In verse 25, then the focus turns to Eleazar, Aaron's son, who is seen to succeed his father, and Moses obeys the Lord's commands, ascends Mount Hor with Aaron and Eleazar, and then there's this solemn ceremony, witnessed, it says, by the entire congregation, and Moses is seen to transfer Aaron's priestly garments to Eleazar his son, and then Aaron passes away on the mountain, and the text and the way it's written, Bible experts say, suggests that his death is seen as somewhat untimely, although it doesn't specify the cause. But what we can see is at the end of his life, Aaron's role as priest, just before he dies, is handed over to Eleazar, fulfilling the Lord's plan of the Levitical priesthood continuing. And the congregation's reaction to Aaron is intense, isn't it? Despite their previous complaints against him, we see they mourn for 30 days, demonstrating that in spite of it all, they see the significance of Aaron's role amongst them. And this event, of course, will foreshadow a similar response that will occur upon Moses' death. The passage then concludes by reflecting on the experience of Moses and Aaron, noting that despite their spiritual maturity and leadership, they still faced consequences for their rebellion against the Lord. So this whole chapter, is highlighting for us the human limitations of even the most high-profile, most devout leaders, emphasizing that everyone is subject to God's will and God's judgment. The story of Moses in its end is surprising indeed, especially in considering his history of obedience to the Lord. Therefore, the key takeaway from the story, as highlighted by Paul when he looked at it and used it as an illustration in 1 Corinthians chapter 10, is the warning, therefore let him who thinks he stands take heed lest he fall. This whole chapter is meant to serve as a reminder that no one is immune to failure, and even the most mature and steadfast believers can still stumble. And the Apostle Paul used the experience of the Israelites here in this chapter as an example for us, emphasizing that despite witnessing all of God's miracle, they fell into disobedience and as a nation suffered the consequences, and Moses and Aaron too. These Old Testament stories are not meant to be just historical accounts. They are illustrations and lessons for us to learn from. This one teaches us the importance of humility and the dangers of overconfidence. In approaching teaching from the Bible, it's a common accepted principle to find an illustration to support what you're teaching. Now, the New Testament, it often states principles directly, but when looking at the Old Testament, it provides stories that embody these principles in their archetypical form. In this case, the principle, you can't miss it, it's very clear. Even those who are confident in their standing still need to be cautious, as pride can come before a fall. This is particularly relevant in communities that are hierarchical. There is a greater level of accountability in such communities, whether that be in the academic world, where knowledge very often leads to a sense of superiority, to the same to those who are called into leadership of faith communities. The lesson from Moses' story and its subsequent interpretation by Paul makes us fully aware that this chapter is meant to serve as a timeless warning to remain vigilant and humble no matter who we are, and to always recognize our own vulnerabilities and the need to depend on God for guidance. It's a call to live with that awareness and not to take your spiritual standing before God for granted. The story indicates that when you think you stand, you still are most in danger of in fact falling. So I do hope that you find that helpful as you continue your journey together through His Word and through your life. Thanks for being with me today. Okay, we're really pressing through these large, dense chapters of Numbers. I do hope you're finding them helpful. I know I'm discovering new stuff every day. And I remind you, the Bible Project Daily podcast is free, always free, on all the main platforms, freely available, and everything about it and around it is copyright free and in the public domain. I make available episode notes page and a full transcript of each episode, and you are fully allowed, encouraged in fact, to take them and use them in whatever way you want to support either your ministry or just your individual devotional life. If you're not seeing those links to the episode notes or the transcript, then simply visit us on the bibleproject.buzzsprout.com. That's the host page, and you'll see active links to all those things there. There's also actually on the note page a facility to send me a text message. Now, it's fully encrypted, so I won't know who you are, and I don't have your details, but it enables you to maybe reach out and contact me, tell me what you think, tell me what you find helpful, and just give me feedback on anything I'm doing. Any messages like that I find, I then will have the ability to maybe read out some of those messages and include them in future podcasts. That's a new facility operated by the people who host the website, the wonderful people at Buzzsprout. As well as that, you'll find there links to ways in which you can connect to the ministry, all the socials, as well as the Patreon community. That's the community of people who've decided to partner with this ministry. Without them, this whole thing would not be able to be freely available in the way it is around the world. So I'm very grateful for everyone who wants to go down that route. But the main thing is, you're here today. Thank you for being with me. Do hope you'll come back here tomorrow. I do hope you've subscribed if you're not already, and that way you need never miss another single episode. And that way you will have the opportunity to spend time with God every day, considering what His Word said, not just doing a daily Bible reading, but an in-depth daily Bible study in which God can reveal His Word and His salvation plan for us. Thanks for being with me today. Bye-bye for now.